Hello, and welcome to Liberty Corps' production of Americanism versus Communism. I'm Victor Roth. I'm here with Dr. Anthony Selinsky this morning to talk about two diametrically opposed worldviews, Americanism and Communism. Dr. Selinsky, let's explore those two worldviews.
Certainly. Americanism can be defined many ways, of course, but I found it in the classroom useful to divide it into five categories or five sets of ideas, and likewise with communism you can simplify it by bringing it down to the five key elements of each of these. In Americanism, Americanism is based on Judeo-Christianity. It's based on what became constitutional republicanism or constitutional federalism, free market economics,
Pick up with
individualism, and ultimately patriotism. Over and against that, communism, rather than being based in Judeo-Christianity or any other religious system, is based in atheism, the belief that there is no God, the commitment to the idea that no God exists, where we have constitutional republicanism. The communists endorse democracy, and that should sound strange to American ears that communism would endorse democracy, but don't forget the American founders, many of them referred to democracy back in those days even as mobocracy.
Mm-hmm.
All in favor say aye. Our system doesn't work like that because it opens up many channels for tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where we have a free market system, or where Americanism is founded on the idea of free markets and free exchange, communism endorses an economic system called socialism, which we can get into in detail later, but it means in its most basic form some kind of forced redistribution from one person or group to another. Where Americanism is based upon the value of the individual, we call individualism, the sanctity of the individual's private life and personal judgment. Communism rests on collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
The group is the entity rather than the individual that runs society. Finally, patriotism in America, which came about after the first four principles were demonstrably successful, gradually moved to what we refer to today as American patriotism. There's no place for that in communism. Communism is a global movement, so communism would move away from any sense of the nation or pride in the nation toward a full-blown globalism.
Mm-hmm. So these five diametrically opposed worldviews certainly have impacts on a society, and those impacts are probably positive, negative type things, and certainly controlling or liberating. So would you say that these worldviews are either liberating, letting a person express themselves freely and openly, or constraining to where it kind of controls the populace? Do those two diametrically worldviews do those things as well?
Well, I think there you have to make a distinction in communism between the theory or the rhetoric on one hand and the practice of it on the other. In communism, we often hear communists claim to be a liberation movement. They're going to free the people. But what they ultimately produce is despotism. Marx in Communist Manifesto says that early on people will refuse to give up their property, and that some sort of despotic inroads will be absolutely necessary. Well, the history of communism seems to demonstrate that those despotic inroads never go away. They become the norm.
Doctor, let's just define this despotic inroad for our viewers so that they've got just a quick concept of what that despotic inroad is. Give us an example or a definition.
Well, a more familiar term for despotism would be tyranny.
Okay.
An inroad is a method or a means of accomplishing something. So what he's really saying is that it will be necessary that tyrannical methods be introduced.
Okay, very good. So in these diametrically opposed worldviews, on the Americanism side, we have Judeo-Christian values. So as a child growing up, and I've done some genealogical research in my time. You know, it used to be that we had children, we baptized those children at early on. We had a baptismal record. As a family, we attended the church of our choice. There was certainly freedom there to do whatever. And you know, we went through the different classes and different trainings, and we became members of the church, and our families then were buried, usually at that church. So we had a lifelong progression of church activity in the family. How does that differ in an atheist or an atheism view?
Well, in communism, there would be no place at all for the church. You can serve only one master, and that master is the collective, the group, the people, as they would say. The masses is the term they would use. There's no room for reverence for any other thing, including human life. The communism is totally a system of reducing life to material elements. There's no room for spirituality. There's no belief in an afterlife. And your behavior is not governed by your internal conscience, at least in the early stages of communism. It's governed by the rules set forth by the committee or by the collective.
Okay, very good. The next on our list on Americanism is constitutional federalism. And so help us define constitutional federalism.
Federalism emerged as the dominant of two competing ideals after the American Revolution. One side was what became federalism, and the idea of that was to have a central government whose charge was mainly to defend the collective states. I hate to use the word collective there, but the association of the states. None of them could defend themselves against England, certainly, and so federalism was the idea that we should retain the sovereignty of the states and the identity of the states and the character of the states. They should be bound together by a central government, mainly for protection and for smoothing out some of the issues that arose between states in terms of commerce, trade, and so on and so forth. The other pool that was ultimately not the ideology that we chose was democracy. And democracy was a system where, or is a system where, it's essentially all in favor, say aye, and the idea of the law is passed or carried just on the simple basis of public opinion. The founders felt that that was a dangerous situation because if public opinion, fueled by emotions, carries the day, there's no predicting where you can end up. And many of the founders, Washington, Adams included, believed that given the passions of the people, no good could come of a government ruled that way. What we needed were moral boundaries. What we needed were rational, logical boundaries. Don't forget, this is the age of enlightenment, the age of reason. And so the Federalists set about developing a constitution that would balance the liberties of the states and of the people with the need for security provided by a bigger state unit. And that produced the Constitution of the United States.
Very good. So on the opposite side of that spectrum, and the communist side, we call this democracy. And we hear that word quite a bit, even in our national news media. We hear that word democracy. Explain democracy and what does that really mean? I mean, we hear that word and we think of voting as what most, I think, Americans would think. So expound upon that.
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand is that none of the founding fathers wanted to create a new tyranny. They all wanted rule by the people, and literally democracy means people rule. Most people rule. Okay, and we've preserved that. The idea was to strike a balance. Now, if you look at the democratic side, the side of the ideal of democracy, the first thing you run into is there are a number of kinds of democracy, running from pure democracy, which would be all the people get together and vote on every issue, up through various forms of representative democracy, and that's what we chose as the democratic element to be preserved in the American system. We do let the people rule, but we let them rule through representatives. Many Americans are not clear on the idea of representation constitutionally, though. The representative in the United States is not bound to simply go to Washington or go to the state capitol and carry out the will of the people. The representative is elected because he convinces the majority of people, the majority of voters, that he shares their opinions, he shares their values, he shares their beliefs, and he may even convince them that on some issues he will be ironclad on that. He'll go right to the Capitol and vote that way. But they're not bound to. They're bound to be leaders. They're bound to represent the general will of the people as they understand it. And the people's check on that is the vote.
I understand. But how does that differ in a communist society?
Well, in practice, in communist societies, there is only ever one party. Parties are not integral to the American system, but they were ways of getting groups of people to be able to express ideas with a little more power, quite a bit more power. In communism, limiting it to only one party, okay, concentrates the power in the hands of whatever group of leaders runs that party. Now, ideally, communism, Marxism believes that in the end, all of that will be done away with, and you'll go to a pure democracy. Pure democracy has never worked. It's always produced tyranny.